Well, it finally happened. The game we've been waiting for, Alireza Firouzja, finally broke through in the Candidates 2022 in his game against Richard Rapport. Um, a little bit later than we had hoped, but he's beginning to regain his old form and at the very least playing some very good chess today. So let's take a look at this game. Firouzja has the white pieces, Richard Rapport has the black pieces, and this is sort of a classic Firouzja game, although the roles are reversed a little bit. Let's take a look. Firouzja plays e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and Rapport plays knight to f6, the Berlin defense. And instead of going into the long, complicated endgame in the Berlin, Firouzja plays the move d3. This is an attempt to keep queens on the board, keep it in a middle game, keep things complicated. Bishop c5, castles. Rapport plays knight to d4 to exchange a pair of minor pieces. Knight takes, bishop takes, c3, and the bishop goes back to b6. Knight to a3, and the idea here, the reason you move the knight to the side of the board is so the knight can come into c4, hit the e5 pawn, hit the bishop at b6. c6 hits Firouzja's bishop. He has to move it to a4. d6, bishop goes to b3. This is clearly the most active diagonal for the bishop. Queen to e7. It looks like Rapport is trying to create a situation where he can choose to castle on either side of the board. Knight to c4 and bishop to g4. And this is the novelty in my database. Hitting the queen at d1, and white cannot play f3 because of this pin. So the queen needs to move. Queen to e1, bishop to c5. Rapport could have played the bishop to c7. The bishop is a little less vulnerable there, but less actively placed also. King to h1 to get this f-pawn out of the pin so it can be moved. At this point, the main pawn break for white is going to be f4. a5, Rapport begins to gain space on the queen side. We see black's idea basically is to just attack on the queen side. Firouzja plays f4, and we see white's plan. He wants to take on e5, open up the f-file, and attack on the king side. a4, bishop c2, b5, and this ends up being a little premature, and it allows a very nice combination from Firouzja. First thing he does is he takes on e5. He doesn't move his knight. That's the key. And here, Rapport cannot take Firouzja's knight on c4. If he takes, then pawn takes knight, hitting the queen, and then after gf6, d4, white is just completely winning in this position with a beautiful center, healthy pawn structure, and a safe king. So he has to retake with the pawn, and now another little tactic. Knight takes e5, queen e5, and now d4, forking the queen and bishop, regaining the piece. Now, Firouzja does end up down a pawn here, but he has compensation, and we'll take a look. Bishop takes pawn, cd4, queen d4. Now, in exchange for the pawn, Firouzja has a lead in development. He has the two bishops, and black's king is stuck in the middle of the board, easily sufficient compensation for a pawn. Bishop e3 gains a tempo, but gives up a second pawn. Queen takes b2. Queen f2. Now, the idea is Firouzja wants to make sure that black cannot castle no matter what. So in this position, castling would be a terrible blunder. If reported castle, then bishop to d4, attacking the queen on b2 and the knight at f6. If the queen moves, bishop takes knight, and after pawn takes, queen to g3 would pin the bishop at g4 against the king, and the bishop would be lost, and so would the game. So instead of castling, Rapport plays bishop to e6. The bishop goes to d4 anyway. Queen to b4, and now he doesn't take the knight, but instead plays this very strong move, bishop to c5. He wants to lock that king in the center of the board. As we know, a king cannot castle over an attacked square. He cannot castle over check. So bishop c5 locks the king in the center. Now, computers say this is equal, but from a human standpoint, white clearly has an advantage. This is such a hard position for black to play. You basically have to play perfectly, move after move after move, and that just isn't going to happen. Queen goes to c3, rook a to c1, putting pressure on the queen. If the bishop moves, the queen would be attacked. Rook to d8, bishop to b1, attacking the queen. Queen to e5, queen to h4, and here already Rapport makes a mistake. It looks like a natural move. Bishop to c4. He's attacking the rook at f1, but by weakening the f5 square, he gives Firouzja a blistering initiative. Rook to f5, hitting the queen. The queen goes to b2. He plays the rook to g1. Another strong idea was rook to e1 with the idea of advancing e5 in the center of the board. Rook to g1, the bishop goes back to e6. Queen to g3, Firouzja continues to offer material. Now it's an exchange sacrifice, but that cannot be accepted. If Rapport had taken the rook, bishop takes, pawn takes, the threat of rook to e1 check is actually just decisive. He's also threatening queen to g7. If black were to guard against the g7 capture with rook to g8, then rook to e1 check would be the end. King to d7, he could block the check a couple of times, but it would just be temporary. Rook to e7, king c8, queen to c7, mate is what would follow. So that rook cannot be taken. Rapport plays knight to d7, and that aims at this bishop. He wants that bishop gone so he can castle. Bishop to d6, he keeps the bishop right in the middle of the board. There's no way he's going to relinquish that diagonal. Queen to d4, and now the rook is threatened, so Firouzja removes it, rook f to f1. h5, the idea is since Rapport can't castle, he's got to activate his king rook somehow, so maybe he can play rook h6, rook g6. e5, Firouzja locks that bishop in place, just screws it into that d6 square. It's not going anywhere. Queen to g4, Rapport is up a couple of pawns. Firouzja cannot take the queen. It actually would be losing after queen takes queen. Those extra pawns would be a big advantage. He just has to avoid the exchange of queens, and he'll keep his advantage, which he does. Queen to e3, h4, and now Rapport is threatening h3, and that would weaken these light squares. The bishop could come to d5, so Firouzja can't allow that either. He plays h3 first before black can play it. Queen to h5, and bishop to e4. Aiming at this c6 pawn and hoping to capture this extra material black has. If black were to, say, play bishop to d5 to block that, that would also be losing. After bishop takes, pawn takes, e6. And you just break through the center of the board, and that would be the end of it. Rapport offers the exchange of queens again. Queen to f3 avoiding. f6, and now bishop to c6. He's beginning to recover the material. King to f7 to get out of the pin, and bishop to b5. And now Firouzja has equal material and all of the advantages that he had before. The bishops, the development, the king safety. It's going to be over very soon. Queen to h5, another offer of the exchange. Queen to e4. Now knight to e5. And Rapport's idea here, he knows that he's lost, but the idea is that if bishop e5 is played, he might be able to play rook to d5 with an attack on these two bishops. It turns out that's not good enough. Firouzja could just take on f6, and after gf6, bishop c4, he has winning pressure easily after, say, rook e5, queen to b7 check, king g8, rook to c1, setting up threats on the back rank, bishop c4, rook c4. The threat of rook to c8 and rook to g4 is simply decisive, so that would still not work, but instead of going into that line, Firouzja plays the intermezzo bishop to e2, so instead of capturing, he just hits the queen and removes the bishop from any possible vulnerability on b5, and after the queen moves, bishop takes e5. White wins a piece because of this pin and the game. Interestingly, Firouzja is often the one whose king is vulnerable and he has to defend, but this was a brilliant game, and it's a shame it happened too little, too late. Maybe it would been nice if Firouzja had gotten some of the lucky breaks that Nepomniachtchi has gotten in this tournament, but at least he's returning to form. I hope you enjoyed this game. We'll see you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.